so much for joining us all for tonight's presentation. We've got a very exciting one for you all. My name is George. I'm the Programs Manager here at the History Center, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's program. Our final lecture in our three-part lecture series titled Indigenous Connections to the Land in partnership with Lake Forest Open Lands. Tonight we're featuring Chief Alexander Robinson and his family cemetery with special guest Mr. Dan Melone, who was here last month, and Mr. Verlyn Spreeman, who will be joining Dan for this presentation. So I wanted to say again a big thanks to Lake Forest Open Lands for co-sponsoring this lecture and for their continued partnership with our Indigenous Connections to the Land lecture series. It was a phenomenal success in having Mr. Dennis Downs here in January, and then Dan last month, and then to conclude this lecture series, we're very happy to have Dan back, and Buzz here will be joining us as well. So thanks again, big thank you to Open Lands. Now, this lecture series was just one part of the citywide multi-organizational initiative called Native Voices, which is continuing on through the entirety of 2023. And there will be programs in partnership with Lake Forest Library, Elbow Farm Foundation, Lake Forest Open Lands, of course, that are kind of spearheading the initiative. And then Borton Community Center will be doing programs all the way through the end of 2023. So if you're interested in more local Native American history programming, I'd recommend taking a look at LFOLA.org/Native Voices. We also have some information near the front desk about the Native Voices initiative if you're looking to get some more Native history programming. I also wanted to let everybody know that tonight's program will be recorded. So if you know someone who wasn't able to make it, or you'd like to rewatch the recording sometime later, we usually get our recordings out by the next week, so about 7 days after the program takes place. So if you registered for this program ahead of time, you'll automatically get an email with that program recording link sometime next week, maybe this weekend. So feel free to share that however you'd like. It's free to watch, and you can share it however you like as well. So keep that in mind. And so with everything out of the way, I would love to go ahead and introduce both of tonight's guest speakers. So starting off, as I said, we're happy to have Mr. Dan Melone back. For over 20 years, Dan has been conducting archaeological research within the Chicagoland area, the Great Lakes region, and Kenya. He has surveyed hundreds of sites and compiled a large database of indigenous and settler sites within the city of Chicago and its surrounding suburbs. Dan also works closely with the Menominee and Potawatomi descendants of Chief Alexander Robinson on the history of the chief, his family, and cemetery. And Dan is joined tonight by Mr. Spreeman. Verlyn Spreeman is a 5-time great-grandson of Chief Alexander Robinson and Menominee Indian from Stirring, Wisconsin. Buzz grew up near the Menominee Reservation, where his family still lives to this day. As you can imagine, the search for Chief Robinson's past has been, and continues to be, a personal journey, and alongside Dan, Buzz continues to research Robinson's history and survey archaeological sites throughout the Chicagoland area, as they have done together for over 18 years. So with that, please join me in welcoming tonight's guest presenters, Dan and Mr. Spreeman.
Thank you all very much. And thank you, George. So, Verlyn, his nickname is Buzz. Everyone calls him Buzz. I can't call him Verlyn. Otherwise, I'll stumble through this night. So Buzz and I, we have been appointed by the descendants of both Menominee and Potawatomi descendants as the family historians, Alexander Robinson family historians. And so he and I have uncovered so much of this man's past. Now, I'm sure some of you know Susan Kelsey. She's worked on the book Billy Caldwell and whatnot. Robinson, Caldwell, Chief Advocates. All these people were actually friends that lived within what is now the Chicagoland area. That they knew each other, they worked with each other, and they worked with the early Americans who inhabited early Chicago. But, excuse me, that said, we're not so much going to talk about an in-depth history of the chief himself. We're going to look at the cemetery. I'll give you a brief history, of course. But we're going to look at the actual cemetery. It still exists today in the Forest Preserve south of here. Lawrence and River Road, we know that the cemetery, the graves still exist. We are not going to give away those locations, the location of the actual cemetery. But there is a boulder today nearby that people can go and visit, pay their respects. And the reason why we don't give out the location for a few reasons. One, the family, they don't want it out in the open. That's one. Number two, the state of Illinois does not want it disclosed. But the problem is, at one point, I did a lot of archaeology for Cook County Forest Preserves, and they dealt with looters, people who all loot sites, no matter what it was. And on the forums, they would talk about looting Robinson Homestead and where they thought the cemetery was and whatnot. And other people, while they visit, their intentions might be good, they go and sort of disrupt the cemetery. Tours go there. You have like 50 people come off of a bus and stop off at the boulder. So it's just better to leave it as it is, not disclose the location, and keep the landscape the way it should be. But that all said, when we look at Robinson, Buzz, if you can move to one slide, two slide, next one please. There we go. So that's the only known photograph of Chief Alexander Robinson, otherwise known as Chichi Pigwa. He was born in 1787. His mother was Ottawa, and his father was Scottish. So a lot of people, you have to understand, records were poor record keeping back at that time. He was born on Mackinac Island, and the thing is, historians seem to go back and forth about the year that he was born. However, we do have a baptismal record, and the record indicates that he was baptized as a Catholic. So his father was from Perth, Scottish. He was a Catholic. And so he and Robinson's mother, after he was born, they went off to Montreal to get Robinson baptized as Catholic. Along the way, his mother passed away. So his birth certificate states, it indicates that he was baptized at the age of 7 years. And that was on May 15, 1788. So it basically places his birth year within November of 1787. Now, as I mentioned, his father was of Scottish descent, but he was in the English Army when he was up at the fort on Mackinac Island. And later on, his father became a fur trader. And much like everyone back at that time, that's pretty much what they did. So his father left the military and became a fur trader, and that's where Chief Robinson learned his trade. And that's what he would do throughout most of his early life. His mother hailed from Green Bay. Now, his father's name was Alexander, but unfortunately, we do not have a record of what his mother's name was. This combined heritage of being Scottish and Native, again, when you look at books from the past, they have words, old terms, we no longer use half-breed, things like that. They also use the word métis, or métis, depending on who you ask, but the French typically pronounce it métis. The thing is that métis culture today is its own specific group. And I've had native métis say, don't call him métis, call him mixed blood, because that's what it was. So we sort of bounce around with these terms, and that's something I often get asked. So he was a mixed blood, Indigenous / Euro-American person who sort of walked between worlds, this gray area. So he was able to work with both Native and Americans. He lived in both societies, and quite frankly, in early Chicago, everyone intermarried. Euro-Americans intermarried into Native families, and when you did that, you became part of that group. You became part of the economy. And that's pretty much what early Chicago was. Now, Alexander himself, over time, he married 2 different women, and at one point, he was married to both of them at once. Good old Catholic bullshit, right? So, in 1810, he married his first wife, Sessos, or Cynthia, and that was up in Michigan. And they had a daughter, Margaret. And that's where Buzz's family, that's where his lineage comes from. It comes from the first wife, Sessos. Sessos was a Menominee. And Sessos died roughly around 1847 here in Illinois. That said, Robinson married his second wife, Catherine Chevalier. And he married Chevalier on September 28th, 1826. The interesting thing is that by that point, he was already a chief of the Potawatomi and the Calumet because Catherine Chevalier's father, who was the chief when he passed away, the chieftain then went to Robinson. So he became the chief first, and then a year later he married the daughter of the chief who passed away. And John Kinsey, he officiated the wedding. So he was the one that sort of officiated over the wedding between Robinson and Chevalier. But at this point, he was still married to Sassos, and Sassos, at this point, though she was the first wife, sort of took a backseat to history. His history sort of faded out of the books, and Catherine Chevalier, she became more prominent. So that all said, throughout the 1800s, quite frankly, Robinson became a fur trader. I'm keeping this all strictly to what I wrote only because if I didn't have this, we're not going to have time to get through the cemetery. We'd be here all night. So in the aftermath of the attack on Fort Dearborn, or the incident at Fort Dearborn, everyone's got a name for it, Robinson actually rescued several prominent early Chicagoans. Now, you look at historical texts. Some say that he was there, others say that he wasn't. And then there was one you and I both had read where he sort of disguised himself and went up the river in a canoe. He wasn't there. He was on his way to what was going to happen because word traveled that it was about to get rough. And so essentially he was on his way. And he got so far and things went down as they did at Fort Dearborn, and so he brought several of these prominent people back with him. And by that point, the reason why it took him forever is he lived in St. Joseph, Michigan, so he's making his way down the lake toward Chicago. He did rescue several of those people, and then on the way back, he brought them on the way back up along the coast on Lake Michigan over to Mackinac Island, where he turned them over to the British. So he, here are your prisoners, turn them over, and the best part is he charged them $100 for the ride too. So he made a little money, but he turned them over because he knew that they would be safe. But they did stop at his house in St. Joseph, Michigan, so people could recover. Kinsey's eventually showed up. He took Helen and his wife so that they could be safe. These people were actually his friends, so he did this purposely to keep them safe. There were other things that went down, but we don't have that kind of time. During the 1830s, Robinson actually moved. So he moved from St. Joseph, Michigan, and he came to Chicago roughly around 1816. He worked with Wilmette. He raised corn. So I know I'm jumping from the 1830s back. But he raised corn in the old gardens of Fort Dearborn because the garrison didn't return. And when they returned, they had food prepared for the garrison, and they sold the food to the returning Americans because Chicago was about to be re-inhabited. So by this point, over time, we get to roughly the 1830s, and Robinson moved to Wolf Point and established a store and a tavern. The best part was he was a teetotaler, but he owned one of the first, if not the first, license to open a tavern in Chicago. And for those of you not familiar with Wolf Point, though I'm sure most, if not all of you are, it's the point where the two forks of the Chicago River meet and flow into Lake Michigan. So during the 1830s, the Treaties of Prairie du Chien and Chicago were signed, and local Potawatomi were forced off the land and west. Now, Robinson was supposed to go west with his people, but by this point, he was already given land. Later on, he was given the whole reserve, and he wanted to stay here. His family, they were based here, his land was here, so he wanted to stay. So he accompanied his people west, and then he returned back to the Chicagoland area, where he lived out the rest of his life. And by 1842, Robinson moved with his family to his reserve on the Des Plaines River. Most of it's forest preserve today. And that's where he sort of lived up until his death in 1872. If you want to look painless for once, and I could make it more difficult. So we have the reserve here, and what you're looking at is 1,280 acres of land. And you have this massive, you see the outline, but what Robinson did was he divvied it up amongst his children. So Alexander at the bottom, which is this section, and then this section would have been for David, and you got Joseph, with a little bit of Cynthia sort of tossed in there, and then up here is Mary Ragger. And this is where they lived, this is where they farmed. But Robinson, quite frankly, he and his family mostly did their farming up and around this area, not too much further south. Those of you who are familiar, or if you're familiar with this area, quite frankly, it's not a nice landscape down here. So there's a reason why he sort of moved his way up. Ignore everything else that you see or take it in, but basically it's part of my archaeological database, so there are other things on here that will not make sense to you unless you know what archaeological site they correspond to. By the way, this is the Peterson-Schussler boys, but that's the 1950s. That all said, Ragger's farmhouse was here, Robinson farmhouse was here, the Coonies were up here, and our friend Joseph, he was down over here. There was a school, the Robinson Schoolhouse. The teacher lived in Joseph Robinson's house. And this entire reserve became this sort of this thing of turmoil for the family because they started to sell it off illegally. You had to have a presidential signature in order to sell this land, and they weren't getting it. In fact, Joseph Robinson, later on, as Alexander was at this point, passed away in 1872. So around 1871, unfortunately, his mind started to leave him, and his body wasn't cooperating. And his son took advantage of that, brought him in, brought people into his room where he was staying, stayed at Cynthia, his daughter's house, and he made his father sign papers. And Robinson had no idea what he was signing; he just signed it. And he signed off quite a bit of the reserve to various farmers and whatnot. And this is sort of the point where the Menominee side have taken off with the whole land claim, but that's a whole other story. And the reason why I'm sort of going through this, the lecture I'm giving tonight is sort of a condensed one because I wanted to make sure we had time for Buzz to talk as well. So there are a number of slides on here, but it's not, the lecture itself is not as long as I typically make it, so we can allow some time for Buzz to talk as well. So, Buzz, if you want to flip to the next, please. We should, at this point, we're going to start talking about the cemetery. Go on one more, please. So, the earliest known image of Robinson Cemetery is a drawing by Carl Bill. This is the second known image of the cemetery. And this is, it's undated, but it's pre-1912. One of the things I did when I wrote my dissertation, and I wrote it on Robinson Cemetery, it was the first analysis of this specific archaeological site looking at landscape changes over time through utilizing photographs, documentary evidence, and looking at vandalism and natural changes to the site. Robinson was buried on the west side of the Splins River at first. And in 1882, he was exhumed. He and his family, the first grave went in 1841. They were exhumed and brought over to the West Bank, which is, they were on the west side, they were brought over to the east side to the current location today. So this is the earliest known image. And when we look at these images, when we try to date these images, we're looking at things like, from the landscape itself, like these posts and vandalism and other things that tell us roughly when these photographs were taken. So here you have number one. This is the back side. So what we're looking at, we're facing west right now. If we came into the cemetery from this direction, we're walking west. Remember, we're Catholic. And in this case, the heads are pointing to the west and their feet to the east. If you look at the cross on top, the crossbar itself is pointing west to east. So this is Chief Robinson's stone. This is Chevalier stone. This is their son, Joseph, Margaret, not the one from Sassos, but the Margaret that he had with Chevalier, and over here that's David's stone. And you have another post here, and this is the Cooney monument. Cynthia Robinson Cooney, her husband Owen, and their two children, Frank and Andrew, are buried here. Chevalier's stone was broken in half. It's actually taller than all of these front row stones. Someone broke it in half. And vandalism is a big thing that plagued this cemetery up until the stones were removed. Now, we often speculated, well, where's the top of the headstone? Well, we speculated it's actually somewhere on the other side. It's pretty obvious, right? It's not until recently, all these years later, maybe 3 months ago, we have a photograph from the front side taken on the same day that shows exactly, and it's propped up against Chevalier's headstone. So, the first image, very grainy, pre-1912. There's a reason why I say that, because the next image, please, is from 1912. It's dated, and the stone itself is repaired. That's Chevalier's stone. It's absolutely beautiful, highly detailed. Robinson's stone remains untouched. You can see the Cooney monument in the background. Unfortunately, the ornament that once adorned the top is gone, but this one is a dated photograph. But as you can see, the vegetation swallowed up the whole cemetery, and that's also part of the reason why this site is so easy to vandalize. People sneak in because of Robinson, who he was. People wanted parts of his tombstone, parts of his family's tombstones, and unfortunately even haul off whole chunks over time. So this particular image comes from the Chicago Historical Society. It's one of the images that you'll typically see when you're looking at Robinson's cemetery. Buzz and I, over the past, quite frankly now, it's been well over 20 years, we've tracked down many of the known existing photographs. They're still out there. And in some cases, we own the originals. So we have gone out, even if we found in newspaper articles, we've, over time, even found those images where they are, and we have copies of everything, which is quite nice, and it helps us to fill in this timeline. And that helps the family, both native sides of the family, understand their family cemetery as well. So it's something that can help them understand their heritage, what they have here in the Chicagoland area, because the Potawatomi side live in Colorado, Menominee up in Wisconsin, and quite frankly, they're all over the U.S. There's hundreds of Robinson family members, but it also helps the state and the forest preserves understand the site that they have, because you go there today, it does not look like this at all. There's absolutely nothing there. Next slide, please. So over time, unfortunately, we do not have any images of the cemetery during the 19-teens. It literally jumps from 1912 up to the 1920s. Now, again, you're not going to see every photograph. We do have a few from the early 1920s, one beautiful one from 1926, but given the limited time we have, we're jumping to 1927. And this is after Chief Robinson's daughter, Mary Ragger, passes away. Because I have my slides flipped, didn't realize until the last minute, we'll be talking about her death after we examine these quick photographs. So, this particular photograph is a set of two photographs. This shows it up close, and there's another one from afar. And here, we are now facing east. And in fact, in the 1912 photograph, we were also facing east. We were looking at the epitaph because the bodies, the graves, are behind these stones. So we've got the sun hitting our backs, we're facing east, and now we see that David's stone has been vandalized. We see that Chevalier's stone has been broken into 3 pieces. And they used Ferris pinning. They literally pinned bars to the back and bolted it to the front. And what you're looking at is rust streaks coming down. Even the chief stone, without the 1926, it's kind of hard to see. If you can go back one, Buzz, to 1912, please. This right here, this beautiful tassel, and you've got the mourning drape over over it. Go back next to the next one, please. It's actually missing in this photo. People are, over time, have been starting to chip pieces off the stone. When you look at the newspaper articles and you listen to the discussions from the past, when you look at those the documentary evidence, it talks about people going into the cemetery, breaking off piece after piece off of the old warriors monument for souvenirs, and a lot of the people that did it were Boy Scouts, believe it or not. But by this point, Mary Rager, before her death in 1921, actually sold all but 10 acres of the 1,280 acres. She sold all of that, including the cemetery, to the Forest Preserves. And the reason being is because the Forest Preserve, she wanted them to care for the cemetery. And so they would come in, they'd clean up the brush. As you can see, they opened it up, right? I mean, yeah, there's brush, but it's not as jungle-like as it was originally when we saw the first couple of photographs. And they removed the wooden posts, and two different schools of thought. Some people say it was the Forest Preserve, others say that it was the Indian Council that erected these monuments or markers on the four corners, because there are 4 of these cairns that were erected around to delineate the spatial boundaries of the cemetery. Supposedly, though, the stone came from Minnesota, so they imported this or brought it down from Minnesota and erected these cairns all around the cemetery. In fact, right back here you can see one of them. What's also interesting is that it's not clearly evident here, but we have the clear images. There's little American flags nestled among the tombstones. And believe it or not, again, blurry image, there's a human being standing here. So several of these photos have people wearing mid-1920s clothing. So these are the things that help us date it. We see that the land is opened up. We see that the stones have been vandalized or heavily vandalized. We see that the landscape has changed a little bit. They're starting to do certain things before adding the fence, which was later added toward the end of 1927. And then we look at clothing, which also helps us to date the photograph. So if we flip to the next photo, please. This is also 1927. This is after Rager dies. You can see some people here in the photograph. And her, Mary Rager, and her husband's graves are over here. They never had headstones. In fact, later on, they would have wooden crosses. But the Forest Preserve even added this side drive so people could drive right up, park, and visit. It came up off of Lawrence Avenue. When you look across the way, you see open farm fields. At this point, we are looking northeast. So they're standing in front of Chevalier's marker at this point. And then here you can see the Cooney marker as well. If you want to flip to the next one, please. So that photograph you just looked at and this photograph are also a pair that were taken in 1927. I didn't add the second one from the first image we looked at. But at least now we can see up close the damage to Chevalier's stone. And we can see, sort of make out some of the damage to David's stone as well. But it's open. The graves of Rager and her husband are right here, and these are the headstones of the Coonies. Next slide, please. So now we've moved into Mary Rager and her death. So that's the chief's daughter, Mary Rager, otherwise known as Munyon. And Mary Rager died on January 8th, 1927. Next, please. And here you can see one of numerous images taken on the day of her funeral. Unlike everybody else, she was buried in a metal coffin. So one of the things I told the state of Illinois when we were looking for a cemetery, I had 3 locations in mind in those woods. When we were bringing out geophysical equipment, ground penetrating radar and magnetometer, and I gave them 3 locations that I thought the cemetery was located, 1, 2, and 3, simply named. They went to the first site, and I told them the Rager's coffin is metal, so the magnetometer would light up like a Christmas tree, and they found it. They walked right over it, and they found her coffin And they were able to map the underground features using these machines, and they did it very quietly. 2 people went in. It was in the middle of the week, like I recommended it, because a lot of people hike through this area. You have people coming in, feeding deer, all sorts of weird things. So they went in, they took care of the business, and then they brought Buzz and I in, and the state archaeologist said, okay, she's right here. So I stood there, and I was able to walk around and tell him who was buried where. But those are the people we know about. When you take the photographs at face value, it looks like 11 people are buried there. But the chief had his friends, his servants, and other family buried there as well. There could be 20 or more people buried in unmarked graves. Even when some of those graves had headstones, markers, many of them remained unmarked. But here, January 8, 1927, we had Mary Rager's funeral. And well over 300 people showed up. You had state senators and other dignitaries who came to the funeral as well. Next image, please. This is an image. We actually own the original photograph. I'm just too lazy to rewrite everything. This is actually an image from the newspaper. We have a view now looking, we are looking southeast. And we're looking from, as you can see up front here, David's headstone. You can see how heavily damaged it is. Chevalier stone, Robinson stone, but here's the open grave of Mary Rager. We've got another image where they show a big mound of dirt just in front of the chief's headstone. And there are 2 guys, one here and one here, and they're removing the plywood boards so they can lower her, in. Many of the people in the images that we have, we can clearly see them, they're leaving. So this is after the funeral. But you can see how people were able to just drive right up to the site. So this is January. Those other images, the earlier images I showed you from 1927, those are probably spring, summer. And there's a reason why we know that all these fit together, because sometime after the summer, the Forest Preserve actually went in and erected a large iron chain link fence around the cemetery itself. But between 1927 and 1928, people stole the fence. So they tried locking. Lock after lock was broken. And at one point, they would steal the fence, they would just hop over it, and so they put razor wire on the fence. None of this deterred people from breaking and entering into the cemetery and vandalizing it and taking souvenirs. So sometime fall, after summer, they put up the chain link fence. So all these things sort of add up nicely to the storyline of the cemetery, to the landscape history. Next one, please. So what's interesting is, a little later, in 1932, the Indian Council Fire decided to restore the cemetery and hold a celebration. And what they did was they went through, they cleaned up the headstones, they disassembled and reassembled with, re-cemented, I should say, the headstones. They leveled everything, made nice little hillocks for the graves themselves, and they even gave Mary Rager a wooden cross, and here's her husband's grave, and they gave him a wooden cross. What's interesting, though, is the Cooney monument is gone. Buzz, if you want to go back to the previous slide, look at that thing. It's massive, and I mean, it would have been like this, right? Someone, in August of 1932, just before they were about to kick things off on September 18th, went in and stole the upright headstone, the monument, this massive, heavy thing. They stole it. All they left was the base. In fact, what you don't see is even in 1928, someone broke in and removed, there were 4 bronze plaques. They removed this one. Someone thought there was money stored inside and decided to test their luck, break into it, and then they took the bronze on top of it all. So the Cooney monument itself suffered far worse, unfortunately, than the rest of the headstone, because it was completely removed from the site. If you move back to me, please. But think about, that's all that's left. And how they did it, the farmhouse wasn't far from here. By the way, we're facing west again, our backs are to the east. It simply astonishes us to think about how these things were taken, because he and I we actually moved some of these headstones, and they are very, very heavy. We'll get to that in a little while. So thinking about how someone could run off with a Cooney monument is mind-boggling. But when they held the celebration on September 18, 1932, it was Agnes Cooney, daughter of Owen and Cynthia Cooney, who her parents are very, very brothers. She remarked, we are powerless against all this vandalism. And they even stole the monument that they gave to my parents. It was a $500 monument. And there was a lot of money for very poor farm women back then to be able to sink into something like that for her parents. So, but the celebration was attended again by several hundred people. And at this point, we actually had several well-known Native chiefs and speakers show up to the ceremony. One of them was Chief Whirling. He was at the World's Fair at one point. So he was able to do that. He worked up in Wisconsin and Wisconsin Dells at one point. He was a tour guide on the Chief Blackhawk boat. He worked with numerous Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts throughout Wisconsin and here in the Chicagoland area. So he became a friend of the family, and we actually have some letters written by him to family members, sort of inquiring here and there about how things are going with the cemetery. All right, Buzz, if you want to flip to the next one, please. So a little later, in 1938, the Steinmetz High School History Club gets together. And they were sort of tasked by the Northwest Historical Society. It's no longer, they went out many, many years ago. They disbanded. But they had a contest. And the kids from Steinmetz, they won. And the children went around and they interviewed all of the surviving, any surviving person who knew the chief, including his granddaughters and his great-grandchildren. And they took these wonderful, we have many photographs, these are just a few, they took wonderful photos of the cemetery itself. Well, at one point, I went back and I thought, if we're writing a book about this, we need to know some of the people's names, We do have the history club, we do have some of their names. But I decided to go back, let's see, if it's 1938, I went back and bought a 1937 yearbook, the antique. I collect antiquarian books anyway in the Chicagoland area. I bought 1937, 1938, and 1939. And it was 1939 or 1938 when I told Buzz it would be interesting if it actually belonged to someone. The book gets delivered. I open it up. There's articles in the back about this day. And the girl who owned the book was actually a member of the historical club that did this, the history club. So she had a hand in it. And there's a photo of her brother in World War II. We even had her graduation tassel. We still have all of it. About 5 years ago, we found one surviving member. Everyone else is dead. And unfortunately, she passed away since. We wrote to her, and then we even called the home in which she was placed by her children. And the son decided against having us talk to her for whatever reason. He felt that it wasn't going to add anything to her life. She was alert, but incommunicable, unfortunately. But she would have understood what we were talking about. So I sent a packet to her. We Xeroxed photos, we sent a bunch of information, letters, things like that. Wrote them a nice thank you for what they did, because if it wasn't for them, there are chunks of this story we would not know about. And we sent it in a packet, and I called the nurse, and I told her, I said, look, the son said we couldn't visit, but you talk to her all the time. Would you be willing to show her these things and read it to her? She said she would. So at least the woman got to, you know, you would think it would be nice if the son let us go do that, to sort of show her what she did. It might actually spark a memory or put a smile on her face. But because of these books, because of these yearbooks, we're able to identify just about everybody in the color guard and just about everybody within the historical history club, science history club. So we're able to give names to most of these people, which is also very nice. One of the things that they did in 1932 was put up a sign about who was buried within the confines of the cemetery. But here you can see the cemetery. You can sort of see the barbed wire up at the top going around. Next slide, please. And this is another image from 1938, sort of a close-up of Chief Robinson's stone, the Chevalier stone, showing the damage, but looking through the chain link fence. Next one, please. So this image was taken in 1938 as well, because we, again, have the clear photos, but you can see the faces. There are two photos to this set. This one, where you can see these two boys. Here's another one from the color guard. And there's another one further back where we see more of the boys. And some of the boys who were in the photograph I just showed you with the color guard kids, they are actually standing in this clearing with these people. Well, for me, having done this for a while, I can identify some. This is Mary Winters. This is Catherine Betcher. Both of them are daughters of Mary Raggard. This gentleman here is Frank Betcher. He's the son of Catherine Betcher. These people confounded me for many years. Didn't know who they were. It wasn't until I came across the Northwest History Club's tours in the 1940s. It's sort of a group shot of people. And there's this gentleman standing there wearing the same clothes, the same look, same glasses, same big floppy ears. We have his name, but the best part, the person who we didn't know, who's standing on the Cooney Monument, the only thing we can observe is that Frank here is not only holding a fedora, but he's holding a Union kepi. There's a picture of him with his arm up talking, and another one with his arm down. When he lifted his arm up, when you zoom in, he's wearing a Purple Heart, and he's wearing medals from the Civil War. Well, accidentally, somehow, I came across this black and white grainy image from about 1939, and the guy had the same suit, same fedora, same medals, same everything. His name is Albert Gage. He was a colonel. We have all the information on him. He actually lived where the Cooneys lived on the reserve. He knew the Robinsons. So this gentleman, Albert Gage, is telling stories about Robinson and the family, and no doubt telling stories about himself. Supposedly he knew Jesse James and a bunch of other BS stories that he told. But it's interesting to be able to finally get a name, put a name on these people. Again, we're hoping to publish a book, so it's good to have all this information. And then over time, someone erected a wooden cross there. It's made out of logs. We're actually facing east in this photograph. So the headstones themselves are right behind us. All right, Buzz, next, please. So this is taken, this one here is taken from 1940s. This is the history tour. This was actually October of 1940. And the History Club went out to view various Native American sites throughout the Chicagoland area, and of course they stopped at Robinson Woods. We do have other images taken on the same day. One shows all of these cars lined up on the street, and another one shows the entire cemetery surrounded by a massive crowd of people. So here you have a flagpole. The flagpole was installed in the 1920s, somewhere pre or just about 1927. You have the gate, the famous lock that everybody broke, barbed wire, Scotch pine trees because of the chief's Scottish heritage, and you can see the missing Cooney Monument. But you can see how open it is. You can see the drive that people would be able to drive up to. At this point, though, not many people drove up to the site. They mainly parked on a busy street and sort of made their way up into the cemetery site. And then further down would be the Raggers, or Raggers/Betcher household in that direction. And then it was surrounded by open fields. Next, please. But over time, vandalism and environmental changes took its toll on Robinson Cemetery. And this is where it gets tricky. So, Robert's man, he was with the Forest Preserve. He wanted to remove the headstones and put a different monument. At the time, he didn't know what it was going to be. He wanted to install a new monument, but he wanted to preserve headstones. So something we get, a question we get is, why did they destroy a native cemetery? We're thinking at it through 21st century viewpoint, a 21st century viewpoint. Should they have done it? No, obviously. But the thing is, Robert's man wanted to preserve what was left of the headstones. By 1945 and 1946, more people had gone in, knocked things over, knocked the stones over, chipped off more stone from the headstones. They left the cemetery in shambles. He actually worked with the family on a plan. He included them in the plan. So it's not like he went in and, did something shady. He worked with the family and said, look, we can preserve what's left, but we're gonna have to remove these things and cover up the site so no one knows where it's at, and then we're gonna replace it with a monument. So these things this idea started in 1945. He started his research. We have his paperwork. Then we look at his documentation, newspaper articles, and one gentleman who I knew personally who had returned from World War II and went to visit the site. It was somewhere around 1946 that they started to raise the cemetery. And by December of 1946, everything was gone. All the surface features were gone. However, it's not until 1948 that they put a boulder in. They installed a boulder and surrounded the boulder by a split rail fence, which you see up here, but not in the right place. What's interesting is that I remember the split rail fence. The boulder is still there. But the split rail fence, that was removed somewhere around late 1982. I remember going to the site. I remember seeing the split rail fence. I remember climbing over the split rail fence. Now the boulder itself, it's not as vandalized as the headstones were, but it is suffering from environmental impact. Water gets into the crevices and cracks, things freeze, they thaw, parts of the rock break off. So on the backside, if you go there today, you're going to see chunks of boulder laying on the ground. They're starting to pop off. But for the most part, aside from people who think they're doing the right thing, or the droves of tourists who come in on the buses, he and I witnessed this, and they want to visit a monument, we get that. But for the most part, at least the boulder, as far as we know, no one's touching it, which is a good thing. I'll flip to the next. So this is, by the way, this is 1948, this image. That was actually a family photograph. The Nobles donated it, so we were able to see when it was installed. Plus, that coupled with documentary evidence saying that the boulder was placed in 1948, we have a clear image of when the stones were removed and when the new landscape was created. This here, however, is from 1966. Yes, it's a drawing, but as an archaeologist, as historians, we look at all documentary evidence, and as silly as it is provide some information, right? We see that there are benches. The benches are still there, though the footings for the benches are the original. The actual wooden benches had to be been replaced several times since being installed in 1948. And it's just this nice little grove surrounded by trees. I remember as a kid going to the corner of Lawrence and East River Road, and it was just a wall of trees, buckthorn and things like that, and you couldn't see in. Supposedly the site is haunted, right? So as a kid, your mind light starts going, it's at nighttime, you're looking through. But over time, restorations have gone through and cleared out all the buckthorn. So now if you go to the site today, it's open, it's clear. You can see the boulder perfectly clearly from the street. They've done an amazing job of trying to keep it up. So, next please. But, in 1979, the historian went through to document bits about Robinson's life and came across headstone fragments. These are two different headstones. One is in situ in the ground, and the other was a broken top. This is actually wider than this. So there were headstone fragments still at the site in 1979. What happened to these pieces? Unfortunately, no one knows. Now, before we move on to the next, well, actually, you know what, move on to the next. This is what it pretty much looks like today. There's the boulder. Here we have the benches. We have oak trees. All of this was dense at one point. All of this was buckthorn. Now it's wide open. You can walk through. Before we move on to the next image, you know, one of the things, I've been going to Robinson Woods since I was a kid. My grandfather took me, my father took me. I've always been interested in his story. You know, you've seen the old photographs, wondered where the old headstones went off to. So we made it our mission to see if these stories were correct. So when I worked for Cook County Forest Preserves, I would ask questions about the headstones, didn't always get a straight answer. But that all said, we inquired about them with the state of Illinois, because the state of Illinois took up the contract for archaeology within the Cook County Forest Preserves. So we told them about the headstones, and we told them about the rumors. Either A, the headstones were toppled and buried on the site, or B, they were removed and put into a warehouse. We couldn't get a straight answer. So I made the state aware, I made my friends with the state aware of what was going on. And it was a team effort to pull off what we pulled off, Buzz and I. I myself am the one that gets all the credit. Newspapers, everybody else, they always credit me with the recovery of the headstone. It was a team effort. It wasn't just me. It was family, colleagues, and all of these different scientists, these people of various backgrounds coming together to basically bring the headstones to light and return them to the family. And so, one day in October of 2014, Verlyn and I were called to the Forest Preserve, and we were on the site with several state representatives, and they said, look, yes, the stones exist. Some of them still exist, which was great news to us. You know, we had put them on the scent a year before. We talked to the cemetery people with the state, and of course, Preserve came forward and said, yeah, we have them. And so we had to get together the family's data, their background, their genealogy, so we could show that as proof that they were indeed who they said they were, so we could get the stones back to the family. But we had the nominee and we had the Potawatomi descendants. So we had to put the stones in a separate location. It couldn't be held specifically by the Potawatomi or Menominee, and that's essentially what we did. So a year later, much had gone on over the year, and quite frankly, up to the weeks leading up to the recovery of the headstone. But on October 13, 2015, Buzz and I and Scott Markus went to Springfield to recover the headstones. The Robinson Cemetery went missing in 1946. There's a reason why they were in Springfield. They were they were down in Cook County. They were then moved to the field headquarters for the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. From there, they went down to the collections warehouse in Springfield, and that's where we went to collect them. So we had to go down there and bring them back. We had to follow protocol. We had to cross all the T's and dot all the I's. And we did it the right way. So no one, government or other, can tell us we did something wrong. Next slide. So October 13, 2015, we went down to the state of Illinois collection holdings, And there's the top fragment of Chief Robinson's stone. This portion right here belongs to David. Down over here is a little bit of David. Some of these pieces belong to David. But we also have parts of Chevalier stone, and we also have a block that would have had footstone in it. Next slide, please. So we walked in, and that's what we have. If you remember Chevalier's headstone with the bolts, there's some of the bolts. A little bit of rust. This piece here belongs to David. This is the upper portion for Chevalier stone. This here is the block where the footstone it would have been inserted into that. This are parts of David's headstone. So this is the bottom part of David's headstone. This is the top part that fits there, and this part fits right about here. It has a broken column because he died in youth. And this piece here is Robinson's upper portion of his, the upright headstone. You can see the concrete from the restoration in 1932. But look how worn the basket is, how worn the drape, the wreath of poppies is. I mean, what they did was, we have both fragments of the stone. They stacked the headstone, one on top of the other. They put this on top of the epitaph. So this is all dark and it's got patina to it. The bottom, it's not in great shape either, but it's in much better shape, or better looking than the top fragment. If you can hit the next slide, please. So what we immediately did after bringing them back from Springfield is, mind you, we didn't know where the cemetery was by this point. That wasn't relocated until 2016. So what we did was we brought fragments of David's headstone, Buzz and I, to the boulder. It was sort of like bringing them back to the land from where they came, It's a neat thing, really. So we brought them back. It was a full circle type of thing. Next slide, please. So this is going back to 1912. No, we're not doing the whole timeline again. But this shows you what the stones looked like in 1912. And through magic, Buzz hit it. Hit it. Next slide, Buzz. That's what we recovered. It's the most beautiful Photoshop I've ever done. I mean, I should start doing Bigfoot images. So you can see the change in color and the patina on this versus this. The epitaph, it's worn flat, but you can read it. And what's interesting is that when we read documentary evidence, even Robert's man and even Henry Roebuck, who documented the site in 1882, or in 1884, I'm sorry, they all state that you can't read the epitaph of the Old Warriors Monument. Well, you can see it clearly, and it's even better in real life. Carlo's seen these things in real life. But you can see only a fragment of Chevalier stone survived, these three fragments. Where the rest of it went, we do not know. So, and remember, Cooney's was stolen. I don't have a wonderful Photoshop of David's headstone, I apologize. But what's interesting is, could both stories be true? Did they topple and bury some of the headstone fragments while keeping the rest? Who knows? We have to go back, quite frankly, and perform more geophysical surveys to find out what's going on at the site. Next slide, please. So we had a press release in 2016, May 4th and 5th. This is May 5th. And there were about, I don't know, almost 200 people crammed in that room. Channel 7 News was there. The newspapers, they were all up front. And we gave our presentation. And the family, we had Menominee and Potawatomi sides there, and everyone celebrated the day. But quite frankly, it was a wonderful time for the entire family to finally have closure on where their things went. And now they had them back. Next slide, please. And this is the photo from the night before, on May 4th. So you can see the image from 1912, but we laid out the stones as they would have been laid in the cemetery. Robinson, Chevalier, and David would have been further down, but just made it easier. And we have Potawatomi representatives and Menominee representatives, and more showed up the next day. More natives showed up the next day for the actual press release. But this is, quite frankly, a very short and small version of the landscape study of Robinson Cemetery, Robinson Family Cemetery. So this is the last photo, or the last slide. Do we have any questions before I turn it over to Buzz, or we can just turn it over to you, Chief, and then we can take questions after that? What do you want to do? You just want to go home. Okay. I'll let Buzz take over for a minute, or two, or three. I'll turn myself off. Thank you all very much. There's no slide, so you can come up. I'll turn mine off.
Put it on the slide with the two sections.
The two sections, what, the land, reserve? Oh, that's slide number 253. All kidding aside, you guys got lucky. It's only 29 slides. The other one had close to 70. When we do this full scale. I'm going to turn myself off. Oh, yeah, here. That's the laser, that's the flashlight. Don't blame yourself. Yep. Yeah. All right, I'm turning it off. All right, that's all I have.
Thank you for everyone coming tonight. I really appreciate it. It shows you're really interested in history, and everybody should be. It should be taught more, in my opinion, in the schools, so the kids and the younger generation can carry on what we started. Dan and myself know that we started this. We've been out 20 years plus, and we've always said from the beginning that we want to educate the children because they're the ones that are going to carry on once we're not around. And you'd be surprised if you go back in your own family history what you can really come up with, how interesting the people really were. When we pick up we find something on the ground, like people call it an arrowhead or a spear point. We always say, like, how many thousands of years has it been since a real human has touched this? You know, it's been laying on the ground that long, and we've got it. Like, what is the story behind this? And they were just like we were. At some points, like on the river, you see like a bend in the river. There might have been a good point where they would form these tools. They would just sit there, just like we would today, sit around and chat with their friends, have some lunch. They would make the stone tools, and they call them chipping stations. We documented a whole bunch of them where they would just sit there on a beautiful day in the woods, you know, chatting. And they were really no different than what we are today, which is a different era. But if you didn't live in that era, of course, you know, we live in ours. So it's just very, very interesting. Now, my family history is, as Dan had mentioned, we're a Menominee Indian from upper Wisconsin. And the Menominees were very lucky. They were one of the, I think, 3 or 4 tribes in all of the United States that got to stay on their ancestral land. Because when it was a kind of a battle between the French coming from Canada-wise and the British coming from the east, they were always battling. It was kind of a battleground, the whole this part of the country. So they kind of wanted to assimilate, some of the ways. Like, you guys got some good ideas and stuff, and bring them on. We want to learn too. But so they were always never really battling. Like some of the tribes, they didn't want them on their land at all, so they would battle them. And of course, they've got moved. The Potawatomis some of them got moved out to Oklahoma. And different things, the Trail of Tears and things like that. And Chicago, when they signed over the land, which Robinson was a signer on the treaty of Prairie du Chien, they got moved out west. So, but it's they got to keep. I think the land is 28 miles by 32 miles, and actually, well, now it's more with GPS and everything. But because when I was young, there's only 6,000 people living on this whole piece of land. And when the spaceships would go around the Earth, that was one of their landmarks because it was pitch black. If you look at Chicago, you look at a satellite view, there's lights all over the place, and that's one way where they could pinpoint where they were. There's a little bitty black dot in Wisconsin. That was the Menominee Indian Reservation. So it's just kind of cool. And I grew up about 5 miles from there. My grandmother lived on a reservation, and we would go there a couple times a week, certainly on Sundays. Family, we always had a big family. Dan had mentioned Robinson married Sasso. She had 1 daughter, and my family always laughs because they always say, go forth and prosper. Well, we've got about 3,000 people in our family, so they took it pretty seriously. So But it's got funny, once you start going, your cousins would make family trees, you start second cousins, third cousins, it just keeps going. But Robinson, in the one article that my family has found was Robinson was an Indian agent out of Green Bay. And when he came through if you think of Wisconsin as like this, the Menominee Reservation is kind of like right up here. So as he was coming down through the territory, he met Sassos, and the article said that she was about 16 years old, and his heart was just smitten by her. That was his girl, and they had her, so they got married. Plus, she was the daughter of Chief Caron. In my family, a lot of the major chiefs were in my lineage, and also the shamans and the medicine people. So that's kind of my family lineage, and a lot of were part of the Bear Clan. And if you know Native American things, there's a Bear Clan. You were maybe good at hunting, or you were the leaders, the bear. Think of the bear. And some people were the Turtle Clan. Some people were the Beaver Clan. And, depending what you were good at. Some people are good at hunting. Some people are good at fishing. So that's just how it kind of works out. Then he met her, and then they gradually worked their way down, along down here to Chicago. So it's kind of cool. And he was in the Treaty of Prairie du Chien is when he got this land. He got it in Prairie 1828, but it actually was ratified by President John Tyler in 1841. Robinson kept writing letters to the president saying, like, please ratify the land, because Robinson was big into education. He gave money to the schools and educate his children. He wanted that. He knew the importance of educating your children. And it took that long for them to ratify it because he wanted to sell some of the land. And it had to be, there was like 12 different points, because at that time the Indians really were thought of as real people, so it had to be looked over by the government and political figures, judges. There was 12 different points. It had to be affidavits, it had to be signed by a judge. It had to work its way all the way up to the President of the United States to be signed off in order for him to transfer the land out of when he was given the land, it was called a land patent. And because it was straight from the government, it was never owned by anybody before. So there was some land signed off by President Grant. Robinson was friends with President Lincoln when he was still an attorney in Springfield. He would go down there because Robinson knew all the major players around here in real estate. So President Lincoln, well, before he was president, would call him down to Springfield and consult with him on there was land sharks, shysters, like Dan was saying, that maybe Robinson signed land over that he didn't know he was signing. And the government agents were going through the middle of the night riding horses. And it isn't like today where you can send an email in a second. It took maybe a couple of weeks to go to Washington. And maybe then they had to debate it and come back. And maybe it was a couple of months before it came back here. But by that time, maybe somebody else thought they owned the land, so they resold it. So then it was just like a big, turned into a big mess. But it's really interesting once you start looking at the history of everything. And one thing, if I had Dan pull this up, is kind of interesting in Chicago history, is this Robinson got this land. There were two sections of land. Each one is 620 acres. And you can see they're kind of offset, because this is I don't know, maybe if you don't know the area, this is the Montrose Avenue up here. And it kind of goes like this in turns. Robinson had his choice of land to pick, and he picked because this is some of the best land in all of Cook County, right along the Des Plaines River runs through here, so that's what he chose. Now this land right here was surveyed in 1831, and there were two different survey groups. One started from St. Louis, and one started from downtown in Chicago. And if you ever look at some of the streets in Chicago, why do some streets in Chicago all of a sudden go up and they take a little jog and go over? Well, that's because they started at two different points, and they didn't have GPS like we did. So luckily they were as close as they were. So when they met, these land surveyors met, and they're like, oh man, we're 200 feet off, 300 feet off. And they're like, well, we're not going to start all over again. We'll just make a little jog in the street and call it a day. So that's what happens at some of the streets in Chicago. And if you look right here, just why I had Dan pull this up is because in the history of O'Hare Airport, you cannot have a satellite city in O'Hare Airport as part of Chicago. So there was a farmer that owned a bunch of land right here, and Chicago wanted to figure out a way to get out to O'Hare, which is over here. And they said, well, we can't have this. This isn't Chicago. This is just unincorporated land and up above here. You know, it's Park Ridge is up here. And so what they did is over here is Chicago. This is right down here. So what they did is the farmer donated some of the land, and it was only maybe, I don't know, maybe 50, 100 feet wide. And so the Chicago then, once they donated the land, it comes along here, it comes over to here, and right here where the cemetery is up here, that there's only, it's maybe about, my guess would be maybe 50 feet. And because the surveyors were off a little bit, if you look on the official survey that was done in 1838, that the two sections of Robinson land are kind of off kilter like this because the surveys from 1831 were just off just a little bit, like a half a degree or something. So if you look on today's map, you notice that right here, it starts out maybe 50 feet, but by the time you get up here, it's maybe 150 feet. And that's how they connected Chicago in the beginning. It came from here, it traveled up here, and once you get up here, then they bought some land through here, you know, which is now Rosemont, you know, up in here, and then they were able to connect O'Hare over here. So,
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but quickly look over here. Look how it starts to get a little wider as you go up. That sliver, that's a street. This is the edge of the reservation, or the reserve. It's not a reservation, so it's literally tilted just by a hair. Sorry about that.
yeah, so now, you know, there's a lot more land on, you know, the Kennedy Expressway goes through here and things like that. But that's kind of a cool history. That's how Chicago figured it out. That's the only way they could do it, is because this little piece of land right here, Robinson's Preserve. And if you look right now, there's a tree line right here that you can see actually the edge, and this is East River Road that goes up here. So that's kind of how they connected O'Hare in the beginning. And I know some of my friends' dads used to go hunting deer out in O'Hare back in the 40s because, you know, planes would come to land and thought they'd kill the deer. Well, we can't have that, so my friend would go out and with his friends, and they would go out there hunting deer. And some of my relatives, not my blood relatives, but my friends that was real good friends with original Mayor Stevenson, and they would go out there and hunt deer and things like that. So it was pretty cool. And actually, the story is, we can't confirm this, but the last bear that was ever shot or trapped in Cook County, there's a hole back here, and they said, what's that?
There's two pits.
A couple pits back here, and they said that was the last bear that was ever caught in Cook County. Was over there. So it's really cool. There's a lot of history. Once, like I said, we've been doing this for a long time, and we just come across these stories. You know, all these cool stories. These stories are cool. We find the boundaries and that. But when we go and we find like handwritten things or stuff from papers, or you know, the daily life of the people, that's what really gets our blood going. You know, like what was their daily life? You know, sometimes they say, oh, we had this for breakfast. It was a cold, rainy day on September, 1823 or something like that. So that's really gets you going. And sometimes you'll find like a little envelope, somebody wrote a letter to somebody or something, and it's just really cool. And my grandfather too, my mom, going back to my mom, when she was a little girl, she was born in 1829. She passed away a couple of years ago. A lot of my family lived long. My dad just passed away. He was 95. My mom was 93. I just had an aunt pass away a couple of weeks ago. She didn't make 100. She was 99 and a half. June 24th, she would have been 100, and she didn't make it. But it's just so cool that my mom would tell me stories when she was a little girl. She actually grew up in a little town. I don't know if you ever went up to the Menominee Reservation, Wolf River Rapids, along the Wolf River. It's real famous for rafting. It's right on the edge of the reservation. And the little town there called Kashina, well, there's a little casino there now, but Kashina did have a boarding school, and my mom was in boarding school when she was a little girl. She just went home on the weekends. So, you know, that was when they cut off the hair and wanted to assimilate you, you know, teach the white ways or Indian ways we don't know, and all this stuff. So that's what she did. And she said that her grandmother, that she was like a medicine lady, and there's still where the casino is now in Kashina. That was part of the land where they used to grow all their little herbs and things, little garden, all their medicines. And my mom said you didn't dare go to Lottie's house. If you sneezed just once, she was reaching up on the shelf and pulling some nasty taste of root off there that you had to eat there, or you wouldn't get out of the house. She said you didn't dare cough or sneeze in Lottie's house, but it worked. And my grandfather even had a story where he wanted to sell a horse, and a guy came over, and the horse was way out in the pasture, and the guy said the horse wouldn't come, so we could check him out. So the guy went down in the woods, cut some root, and he chopped it up his hand, and he went like this, and the wind was blowing, and the horse's nose came up in the air, and the horse came trotting over and was eating the root out of his hand. And my grandfather always wanted to get what was that root, and the guy wouldn't tell him. The guy passed away with the secret of the root made the horses. And my grandfather was actually, when they were logging off of Wisconsin, the northern part, and a lot of the wood king actually built Chicago, that he was worked in the woods, and he was sharpening the blades for the saws because you were paid by the tree, how many trees you could cut down, and you paid that, that's how you made your money. And so he was one of the best saw sharpeners in the whole camp, so that's where he made more money sharpening saws, and he didn't cutting down trees. So, but that's it's kind of a cool story too. So he did that, and I could go on too. Talk with Dan about the family stuff, but it's really cool. When I moved down here, I moved down this area in 1982, and then different people. I started been kind of interested in history, and then I live in Norwich, which is like 5 minutes down the street from the Robinson Stone, and people were like, "Oh, there's a Native American guy buried over there." And I thought, "Oh, that's cool." Well, then I started talking to some of my relatives, and they said, "You're related to that guy?" And I go, "Really?" So then they started telling me the genealogy and telling me the stories, and I got interested, and I started reading in the local historical societies, and then that's where I met Dan, and they had a doings down there, and then we just decided to work together and keep going, and what can we turn this into? Sometimes we find articles from UCLA. How did it get out there? Well, somebody was living here, they moved out there, they passed away, gave it to their kids. Kids didn't want it, they donated it to UCLA, and that's where it is. So it doesn't stop, it always keeps going, and Dan's more on the social media than I am, and people contact him all the time. It's like, "Oh, I think I'm related," or "I got a family member," or somebody calls up, "Can you come and look at stuff that we found on the ground?" How many years ago we met from this area, Joby. What was his last name?
Joby Cerny.
Yeah, he's actually was the voice for Pillsbury Doughboy, and he thought that he found something on his land, so he wanted us to come check it out. So we come up on Saturday morning, and it's 8:30 in the morning, his hair's all messed, his wife's making coffee, and Dan looks at him, he says, "You're not going to make me do that, are you?"
Don't do it.
"Yeah, we are." He goes, "Okay." So Dan poked him in the belly, he goes, "Hee!" So, okay.
I made him say some lines.
Yes.
I got a picture of me.
So I said, "We're cool with that," so that was cool. And just one last story is with Robinson, he, like I said, he was really educational with the church, and he wanted written into the Prairie du Chien Treaty that he wanted 6 sections of land. Now, a section is 680 acres. He wanted 6 sections of land in the northern part of Chicago given to the Catholic Church, and he wanted that written into the Prairie du Chien Treaty. But the government said, "No way, we're not doing that." So, if that would have been written, this whole area, well, at that time, would have been part of the property of the Catholic Church. Robinson also was instrumental in bringing a priest from St. Louis out to Chicago, and we found the ciborium. It's a wooden one. We found that the people they didn't even know they had, and actually the priest went down to South Bend, Indiana, and they built a mission in a kind of a low ground, but a couple of years later they rebuilt it on a high ground, and it actually turned into Notre Dame. So it's really cool that back then you were prominent people, and you knew your friends. Robinson he was like the 6th richest person in all of Cook County, so he certainly had the contacts. But then who knows, all these people, Kinsey, all these streets that you see in Chicago. And a lot of the people, even up on the reservation, they have last names of people that are here. It's like, wow, they just moved up there, and really, really, really close. I mean, my family always says, "Well, how can you, be from Wisconsin and root for the Bears?" I said, it just happens, it's kind of fun, we get back and forth. But anyway, that's about what I got. I hope you enjoyed my little family history thing. And again, I thank you all for coming, and if anybody has any questions. Yes, sir.
I think it's just south of that map, south of Irving Park Road, there's, what I guess is a forest preserve, at least there's a sign in the parking lot that says Chichi-Pingwa. But I guess it must be just kind of.
That's right here. That's, I'm sorry, it's, this is Lawrence, so you come down, this is Schiller Woods. So you've got, as you come down here, here's Irving Park, that's where it's at. So this is Chichi-Pingwa Forest Preserve,
Yeah.
and back over here is Hidden Hill. Did you grow up in that area?
No, I drive by it. I visited a contemporary cemetery in the area, so I kept seeing the sign and wondering what it was about, and now I know.
Chichi-Pingwa was Robinson's native name. It means blinking eye. He had a facial tic, caused his eye to twitch. And so they just sort of used that.
So it's on the site there, but it's not related to the.
Oh, it's related. It's literally in the reserve. So if you look at this giant squarish chunk here,
Right.
that's right over here. Comes around up this way, and Chichi-Pingwa Forest Preserve is this entire thing right up through here.
Okay.
Because then further down you go, right over here, you have a golf course. In fact, the line of the golf course comes through here. You have Addison Avenue. And further down, this is La Formosi's reservation, or reserve. I keep saying reservation, but it's La Formosi's reserve. So they had their two reserves, and Caldwell had his on the Chicago River.
There's a showing where the water pump is. Everybody says it's like some kind of sacred water.
The magic water pump is literally right here.
It's just a water
The
pump.
fountain of youth, they call it. I grew up in the area, and it has the best tasting water, blah, blah, blah. But they got those pumps all over the Cook County preserves, and as a kid, when we ran through, you pump water, you drink it. It's well water, it's not coming, people say it comes in from, it's piped in from Canada, it flows in. But they call it the fountain of youth, and there's lines of people pumping bottles, they've got bottles and jugs, and
There's buying cars and they have those big blue.
yeah.
Yeah.
You can look it up online. They did every so often they write an article about it.
In the 40s, there used to be a spur line coming into Sherwood Park, because this was always a popular area for Chicago people to come during on the weekends to party. There's slabs of concrete where they would have spur dancing and everything. They would come to the city, spend the day, get back on the train.
You'd have them right over, in fact, right over here. You have one right over in the clearing down here where the words are. There's a clearing, and there's a little structure, a CCC built structure, barbecue area, and they had a dance pad and things like that, and they had them all through here. In fact, yeah, even throughout Schiller Woods, you'll sometimes come across these old pads. At one time, they may or may not even have a structure over them. Most have been disassembled, so over time. But, you know, it's sort of to piggyback on what Buzz had said about education and religion. Now that I'm not looking at my stupid script, I can actually speak. It's more for your benefit that keeps me on track, because, like I said, I can definitely be long-winded. So Robinson and Billy Caldwell were part of the petition. They went around early Chicago and gathered a petition of names to send down to St. Louis. They petitioned Bishop Rosati, who then sent a Frenchman, Father St. Cyr, who came up to Chicago. And Caldwell and Robinson went around, they tried to find a plot. And so at one point, St. Cyr he performed mass out of Bobby and Sauganash Tavern, but then a little plot of land was secured, and Caldwell and Robinson helped St. Cyr build his first church. And in October of 1833, the doors of St. Mary's opened, and St. Cyr presided over Mass for 300 Potawatomi people that showed up. So you had 300 Potawatomi. The first day he opened the doors, and he said Mass for 300 Potawatomi and everyone else who happened to be in the vicinity. And then the other part of it is that Robinson and Caldwell were also integral in the early politics of Chicago, helping to get and create the first elections, quite frankly. They put all of this together, or had a major hand in it. Quite frankly, you know, I tell the same story that a friend of mine, a native friend of mine, says the same thing when he lectures at that, you know, Caldwell and Heptakistic and Robinson. They were part of the very first early Chicago machine. They were the early Chicago politicians. You can go back in time, take them out, bring them to the 21st century, put a modern suit on all of them, and they'd probably blend right in with the politics. The way they handled things back then is, it's interesting. I mean, again, with Buzz talking about the land and the landscape and the land patents, Robinson keeping an eye on the lake, watching what was coming into Chicago, pretending he was ignorant, even though he could read or write, taking tally on everything that was coming in. He kept notes. He kept notes, and he really did. He played the game, and he played it well. And he was a well-liked person, too. You know, if you look at the interviews, people who knew him, they all say the same thing. He was very hospitable. You'd go to his house on the Des Plaines River, and the first thing he did was he picked out a calf, and he had it slaughtered so you can eat. It's the same thing we do in Kenya. Pig, goat, cow, whatever. And those early Chicagoans who went to visit said the meat was so tough, but they didn't want to disappoint him because he was very hospitable to them. Other stories like Mark Bobian and his friend George Tucker, one day, 1860s, they go to visit Robinson. I literally told this story on Sunday to a Potawatomi descendant of the Bobians. And so they went to visit him at his house on the Des Plaines River, which would have been right about there. And they go up on his porch, and the three men sit down. They brought a nice big jug of whiskey. See, I would have gotten along really well with Robinson because I drink really good whiskey, and I actually do smoke cigars and pipes, and he enjoyed pipe smoking as well. So he's sitting there on the porch, they're drinking the whiskey, they're smoking, and they're telling me stories. And Bobian was an early Chicagoan. Mark Bobian, we all know his name. He considered himself an expert on early Chicago history, because he was early Chicago history. But they sat and talked, and Robinson brought up Black Hawk and a wampum string, and proceeded to tell this whole story. Bobian had no clue this occurred. And when he did, Robinson's children and grandchildren came out, and everyone sat around because no one actually heard this story before. And he proceeded to tell everyone this very long story about what had happened the year before the Black Hawk War to him personally, you know. So you just get this idea of this, at that point, this grandfatherly man sitting there, you know, having a chat with his friends, and they talk about the warming influences of the whiskey taking over, and the stories are just flowing left and right. And it paints this human picture. And it's like Buzz had said, you want to view them as people because they were people. They're not some mystical thing, you know. Native people are humans, and it's weird to say that in 2023, but non-natives have this image of Native people, and Native people just want to be, you know, viewed as human beings. Both in the past with the stone tools on the wall, people made those things. People have been here for 13,000 years. For those of you who had suffered my last talk, you heard it. They've been here for 13,000 plus years, and they all have their stories. They are all connected, not just to the land, but to Chicago's history, long before any of us, including Robinson, quite frankly, came to live in this area. So I'm going to stop there because I know other people have questions. You see, I can cut myself off. Carla, I thought your hand was raised.
Yeah, I've seen that Robinson purchased a lot of land in Cook County. And it would be him with other people within the same land patent. If you look up in BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, you can search by county and last name, and it'll show you. And one of them included either the Calumet River or that and the Little Calumet.
And he had land down in Naperville, if you look. That's where his daughter Mary Rager, she was born down in Naperville. In the Naperville area, in fact, if you look at the old maps, which I know you have, there's a trail that goes from his reserve down to Naperville. And he would take his daughter down to the Calumet area to view the grave of her, what she termed her Indian mother. That's what she called Sassos. Her mother was Catherine Chevalier, also native, but her quote-unquote Indian mother, she was buried down there. I think I know the location, but Menominee got a different idea, but I'm telling you right now. So, yeah, he had land, strips of land everywhere. I mean, look at Norwood Park, he's got strips of land in there somewhere, you know.
Our family story, we can't confirm it either, that when he married Catherine Chevalier, you know, two wives, and they're not, probably not going to get along too good. So then she took her daughter Margaret, and we're also related to Chief Oshkosh, where the city of Chief Oshkosh is named after. And she moved back up to Oshkosh, where Chief Oshkosh tribe, and lived all her life up there. She's married, buried near what was a lake called Lake Poyet up there, but we can't confirm that either. That's just passed on through family.
Yeah, but Rob, I'm not going to debate it. Go on.
Yes.
I'm not too sure, was the Kinsey family saved by Robinson during the Dearborn incident?
He sheltered them
He sheltered.
at his house in St. Joseph, Michigan. So people started trickling up. Some of them he would come and grab and paddle them up to his house, but the Helds he brought all the way up to Mackinac and just sort of turned them over to the commander of the fort at the time. Yes?
On Alexander Robinson's headstone, and I don't know if I have the wording right, I don't know if you want to go to the slide. I have a question about something.
We'll go to the oops. There we go.
Well, it's more detailed where it says he's chief of the, maybe it's on the newer headstone.
Oh, it's the Chippewa, Ottawa,
It says
and
chief of
Potawatomi.
the Potawatomi, Chippewa,
Yeah.
and Ottawa.
Yeah,
Was that his actual role at the time, or was that a
That's
title
three.
added later?
they were the three fires.
Right, but
So that's what he was. He was
that's
sort
how
of
he
this-
was known at that time.
Because one of the things I didn't mention in all of this, believe it or not, is that just before the Treaty of Great Machine, the Anishinaabe people gathered together and voted he and Billy Caldwell in as chiefs for those three, and that's why that came about. So he was the chief of that specific Potawatomi group in Calumet because of his father-in-law, but he was voted in for the rest later on to negotiate the treaties with Billy Caldwell. What's interesting here is you notice he died at 110 years, even though there are beads in front of it. He didn't. He was born in 1787. So it was John Kinsey who spun this BS. He's the one that created, because his own family didn't know how old he was. So they asked John Kinsey, like, oh, yeah. He was born in 1872. That's why it says 1872. He did die on April 2nd, it's just a year ago. So, yeah, he wasn't that old. And if you listen to the lore, they had him farming right up to the day that he died. Unfortunately, he had dementia. And at one point, it was so bad, I mean, he would get out of the house, and neighbors would find him in the room. One time he got out, and he actually broke his shoulder. There were his doctor, who, if you know anything about the area, you got to read, what was that, the Reed what? Was the old mental facility or, the institution. And the hospital that was there, the original, that was his doctor. He was the director there. He was the one that headed up that hospital. He would go and visit Robinson from time to time. And one time he went into his room and he saw a tomahawk, a rifle, and his war club. And there were, we have testimony from his daughter. The judge had asked, or not the judge, the interviewer had asked, didn't the doctor find this rather strange about these things in his room? And she replied, well, no. I mean, he basically said those were things from his past. And it was part of him. It wasn't strange for him to have something like this. I mean, think about this, in this day and age, when you have somebody who has dementia, let's say they hunted, you're not gonna leave them in their room now with their shotgun. But back then, it was just a part of who he was, they were his belongings, they were in the room with him. Unfortunately, there were times when he would load the gun and fire it out the window. And his daughter came in and asked, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well," and these are his words, not mine. There were hostile Indians out there, and I was shooting at them. There were other times where he would see his friends outside the window. He wanted to go outside. No one was there. And either case, there was no one out there. It's just, unfortunately, this is how his mind translated it to him. It's sort of sad when you think about someone who built up or helped to build Chicago, the foundation of our Chicago today, and this is what happened to him over time. But it's, it's part of life, and it's what happens even today, unfortunately. So, but otherwise, anybody else with?
The remnants of the stones, are they something you can see, or are they under lock and key at some reservation?
Buzz and I are the curators. We actually do have them under lock and key. And quite literally, the keys are on his key ring. This is the key to the room that goes, and the key to the building and everything else. So they are under lock and key. We actually started a whole not-for-profit group, brand new. But part of it is that we are doing archaeology and educational work. And we're going to be working with different colleges, universities, the general public, and things like that. Not so much with the stones, but part of it is with the Robinson Heritage Preservation Collective. That's not the full name. But essentially we have a room for a laboratory, a couple of offices, equipment room, and lecture room as well. So we can do what he and I have always dreamed about doing. It's not only spreading the word about Robinson, but then also sort of spreading out and doing educational archaeology and history within not just the Chicagoland area, but quite frankly, northern Illinois.
Great Lakes area.
In the Great Lakes area. And some of it, people in Michigan want to join in, or upper Wisconsin, fine, we can do these things remotely as well. But I've got other archaeologists interested in what we're doing, so we're trying to tie it in. And we're working with the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian as well. Ironically, the director of the Mitchell Museum is a Menominee, Buzz's cousin, and she's related to Robinson as well. So that's what we're doing at the moment. We literally just formed this. So I'm not putting it out there, but I might as well. We're looking for donations as well, because we're going to need something. But that all said, the stones are being housed in our collections room at the moment. We do use them for educational purposes. One of the things I told the family, because with Native people, there are certain things you just don't do with objects. But the family, they understand the educational component, as long as Buzz and I are the ones handling it with people. So no photographs can be taken of these things, except by us. But it's part of how we can tell the story to the general public, not just adults, but children as well, to come see these things and hear the story about Chief Alexander Robinson. So that's essentially what we're doing at the moment. So it's, So, we did it once. We brought them out. It was for an open house of a very small historical society. In a room, I would say, Carla, would you say this room's about as big as that room was?
Yeah, I think so.
And we've done open houses, Buzz and I, before he flint naps. Usually we sit in the corner. This is typically how it goes. We sit in the corner. He has his flint napping equipment. I have lithic materials, stone tools, and interested people come up and we talk about people, prehistoric people. And usually you get maybe 10 people, and then they're over by coffee and things like that. Robinson's a big thing in Chicago history, and historians, not only with historians, ghost hunters, archaeologists, people who love urban legends and lore, and then the general population who have an interest in early Native people in Chicago. They want to see these things. But the headstones themselves have always remained a mystery. Where did they go? What happened to them? How did they disappear? And we're the ones, with our colleagues who recovered them. So this was a big thing. So we put out the word. The headstones are going to be out. They're the first time since they were removed in 1946, they're going to be able, people could come and see these things. So Buzz and I sat in a corner waiting. 300 people showed up. We were pinned into the corner. People in the back were screaming they couldn't hear us. We weren't prepared for lectures. They had to bring us a microphone. We were pouring sweat. A horrible day to wear a tweed. I did not know that. We did not see that coming. They were not only coming down the stairs in droves, they were coming down through the elevator. The building, the facility, the library that housed the Historical Commission, they just had, no one could imagine this was going to happen. And we were pinned, and just people just kept pinning us into the walls. I don't know how that building held that many people. I mean, they had to shift. You couldn't fit all 300 into the room because, yes, we had our thing, but the Historical Society had their tables going around as well with their things. So and then of course you got the coffee station and the cookies, all that disappeared. So yeah, Buzz and I it was insane. So that was the first time that we did it. We plan on doing it again, but we need to figure out the logistics of that because that was insane. So that answered your question in about 2 hours. I apologize about that. Any other? Yeah.
Is his home in St. Joseph, Michigan preserved, or what's?
Not that I'm aware of. All that is unfortunately gone. That would have been around 1812.
We want to go up to Montreal someday and just go through their records up there. Because we looked at the Catholic Church records, well, we tried to up in Green Bay, and we've known a lot of things, the church burned down and all the records burned down. But I thought back in the day, you just didn't make one copy, you made maybe 8 or 9 because you knew half the places were burned down. So like I said, it doesn't stop, so we just keep going.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'll just say a word or two before we adjourn for the evening. Dan, Buzz, thank you again for such an incredible presentation, and thank you all for coming this evening. I'll just say a few words about some upcoming events. Native Voices will continue to represent in the History Center. On April 14th, we're hosting a discussion in partnership with Lake Forest Library and Lake Bluff Public Library. There'll be an author here by the name of Ursula Pike who will be talking about her new book, In Indian Among Los Indianos, I believe is the name of the book. And so that is an event partnered with both libraries for the Read Between the Ravines is what the program is called. So that's going to be hosted here on April 14th. Besides Native Voices, we're wrapping up our Art of the Miniature exhibit run, which has been available since November. The weekend following this upcoming weekend, April 1st, that is the last day to see the exhibit, so if you haven't seen it yet, I recommend you take a look around the museum. We'll probably be open for another 10 minutes or so. And then we're also wrapping up our miniature-themed programming. So this Thursday, 2 days from now, we're having Lindsay Micken-Morgan here to give a presentation. Lindsay is the former curator of the Thorn Rooms down at the Art Institute of Chicago. She was in that position for about a decade, and so she'll be speaking about her past experiences working and curating the Thorn Rooms while she was there at the Art Institute. So if you're interested in miniatures, we've got something coming up this week. Native Voices will continue on through the end of 2023. And then just a final note, I wanted to say if we have any members, History Center members in the audience today, thank you again for your continued support. It's your dedication and being involved and continuing to support us that allows programming like this to continue to be free and open to the public. So thank you to any History Center members here.